Shalom to everyone. I would like to talk to you today about the topic of time. Time is one of the most extraordinary phenomena we have in our world of reality. On the one hand, it is very hard for the human intellect to understand concepts that are connected with time, such as infinity, eternity, changes in the flow of time, traveling through time. These are ideas that is very hard for the human intellect to grasp. On the other hand, there is no feeling as strong as the feeling that we have that we are living inside a flow of time. We are constantly living from the past to the present to the future. Man is bound by the boundaries of time, yet he strives for life of eternity. He strives for transcending the boundaries of time. In order to start to understand the concept of time, I'd like to bring before you a very basic definition brought by the Maharal in his book Or Chadash. The Maharal says the following: Havaya shehi bazman, the existent being that is within time. Yesh ba hishtanut, is constantly changing. Lefichach, therefore, nivra mizeh hazman, therefore time was created through this. Shehu mitchalek, and time is divided into separate parts. Umizeh hu mitchadesh ha'avaya asher bo hashinui, and from this the existent being is created, and this existent being is constantly going through changes. The language of the Maharal is a bit difficult, but what the Maharal is saying is something very basic. Time is the result of changes. Since there are changes in our reality, we can distinguish between the previous moment, this moment, and the next moment, and we sense that there is a flow of time. In order to understand this a bit more, I'd like to bring before you a few examples. Let's say that a person at the first moment is sitting in the living room, and the next stage he goes into the kitchen, and in the third stage he goes into his children's room. Since there is a difference between where he was at the first moment and where he was at the second moment and where he was at the third moment, we notice that there is a difference between these stages, and we can identify a flow of time since there's a difference between the first stage, the second stage, and the third stage. Even if man is not in movement, still his environment, his surroundings is always changing, is also always moving. Let's say the man is sitting down. At the first stage, his children are sitting down near him. At the second stage, they get up and go to the hallway. And at the third stage, they leave the house. Here too, we can identify the difference between the previous moment, this moment, and the next moment. There's a difference between reality in each of these stages. And therefore, we can identify a flow of time since there is change in reality. Even if man is not in movement, and even if his environment, his surroundings are not in movement, still his physiology is constantly changing. The flow of the blood, the breathing system, the nervous system, the internal system, his body is constantly changing. And therefore, even if man is not in movement, still his body undergoes changes all the time, and we can distinguish between the previous moment, this moment, and the next moment. So time is a result of changes in reality, and our reality is constantly changing. But if there are no changes in reality, there is no meaning to the flow of time, and there is no meaning to the sequence of time. To understand this a bit more deeply, I would like to bring before you a hypothetical experiment. Let's say we're to take a man and put him in the deep freeze. Put him in at the age of 20, take him out 10 years afterwards, still 20 years old. Why? Because his body hasn't changed. No physiology changes have occurred to his body. No changes have transpired to his body. Nothing happens, no changes occur, and therefore there is no flow of time concerning this specific person that was put in the deep freeze. However, we outside have changed. We've changed by 10 years. We've come 10 years older. The physical world has changed by 10 years. since there was a flow of time. But when we were able to freeze the changes, when we were able to stop changes in this person, this specific person, nothing happens, no changes occur, and there is no flow of time. About a month ago, my wife said, since the family is expanding, we have to buy a time machine. I said, okay, you want a time machine? Buy yourself a time machine. So my wife ordered the time machine, paid by credit cards, and we have now in our house a time machine, 170 meters height, just about my height, 50 centimeters width, 70 centimeters length, and it's standing in a small place in the hallway. On Friday mornings, my wife and my daughters bake challah for Shabbos. Sometimes they bake a large amount of challah, and we don't need all of them for the same Shabbos. What does my wife do? She takes the challah and puts them in the time machine. Next Friday, she takes the challah out of the time machine, and we have fresh challah for Shabbos. When the challah were put into the time machine, they were 3 hours old. When they were taken out a week later, they were still 3 hours old, fresh as they were put in. The reason for this is that time was stopped. This time machine stopped the flow of time. It froze these challahs to a state that no changes occurred, no changes transpired to them, and we take them out a week later, they're still as fresh as they were put in. Now let's say we were able to freeze reality. Let's say we were able to freeze all of our physical world. What would happen then? Nothing. Nothing would change. Nothing would change in all of reality. There would be no difference in the state of reality between 5 to 9, 9:15, 9:30, 12 o'clock, 4 o'clock. Nothing changes. Just one frame where nothing changes at all. In such a situation, in such a reality, there is no flow of time since nothing changes. There's no difference between the previous moment, this moment, and the next moment. This is what is called eternal present. When nothing changes, where you have just one frame of existence, there is no flow of time, and there is no meaning to the sequence of time. So time is a result of changes in reality. And when there are no changes in reality, there is no meaning to the sequence of time. There is no flow of time at all. Now let's take this conclusion one step further and see, why is our reality such that it undergoes changes all the time? Why is our reality changing all the time? The answer to this is because our reality is a physical reality. Our reality is composed of matter. Our world is a physical world. And the physical world is constantly going through changes, especially to the form of decomposition. Our physical reality is always changing because the main characteristics of matter is that matter undergoes changes all the time towards decomposition, what the scientists call entropy. This is a very interesting idea that our physical world is going towards destruction, going towards decomposition. But that's an idea that should be expanded some other time. In any case, our reality is a constantly changing reality since it is composed of matter. Our world is a physical world, and therefore it is constantly going through changes. Therefore, time is connected only to the physical reality, since the physical reality is constantly going through changes. But if we were to talk about a reality that is non-physical, that is spiritual, that doesn't undergo any changes, there would be no flow of time. We will expand on this idea a little bit later. So now we have come to another conclusion. Time is a result of changes in reality. And our reality changes since our reality is a physical reality and composed of matter. But in a reality that is not physical, there would be no meaning to the flow of time. Time is connected to the physical world. This idea is brought in the Maharal. The Maharal says in Gvurat Hashem the following: Da ki hazman yesh lo yechus el hageshem. Know, says the Maharal, that time is connected to the physical world. V'davar ze mevurar, and this idea is clear, למי שעיין בחוכמה, to those who looked into the wisdom, like you, maybe like me also. כי הזמן נתלה בגשם, says the Maharal. Time is connected to the physical world. כי הזמן מתחדש מן התנועה, since time is created through movement. והתנועה היא לגשם, and movement belongs to, is connected to the physical world. והמעיין ידע, and one who looks into this will know, כי הזמן, that time, והתנועה, and movement, והגשם, and the physical world, משתתפים ומתייחסים בכל דבר, are all basic components of our reality, are all dimensions of our reality. So, time is a result of changes in reality, and our reality changes since it is a physical reality, our world is a physical world. Let's take this idea one step further, and it will lead us to a very interesting conclusion. Since our physical world was created from complete nothingness, then time too was created. Time is part of our creation. Time is a concept that was created. That's a fascinating conclusion. But when we look into the Jewish sources, we look into what the commentators say, we'll find this is a very basic idea. The commentators on Bereshis all say the same idea. Says the Ramban, Mishiyeh yesh, the minute the physical world was created, Yitafes bo hazman, time attached itself onto the material world. Time sort of hopped onto the material world. The Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim also says, Ha'olam bechlaluto, all of our reality, Hashem himtzi'o, Hashem created it, Achar ha'heder ha'muchlat, from complete nothingness. V'gam hazman atzmo michlal ha'nivraim, time too is one of the creations of reality. The Sforno also says on Bereshit, says the Sforno, B'tchilat hazman, at the beginning of time, V'hu rega rishon bilti mitchalek. This is the first moment that cannot be divided into separate parts. Shelo haya zman kodem lachen, since time didn't exist beforehand. The Vilna Gaon also says on his commentary to Bereshit, Bereshit hama'amar shel briat hazman. Bereshit is the word that defines the creation of time. So we see that all the commentators say that time is a creation. This is a very fascinating idea, to say that time is something that was created. So now we have come to another conclusion. We have a deeper understanding of time. Time is a result of changes in reality. Changes in reality take place since our reality is a physical reality, and since the physical world was created, time too was created. Now that we have this understanding, we can take even one step further and understand even more deep ideas, such as changes in the flow of time. Rabbi Dessler says in Michtav Me'Eliyahu, volume 3, he brings before us a very interesting idea. Says Rabbi Dessler, our world is composed of limitations. Space is a limitation. Time is a limitation. You can't go from one place to the other without traveling through the space between the 2 points. You can't come from one place to the other without it taking a certain amount of time. These are limitations. And these limitations, says Rabbi Dessler, is what we call nature. And we're used to thinking that we can't overcome, we can't transcend these limitations of nature. However, this is not true, says Rabbi Dessler. When there is a spiritual requirement, when there is a spiritual need, all these limitations of time and space disappear. A very interesting example is brought by Rabbi Dessler, which is connected to Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov Avinu was traveling from Har HaMoriah towards Haran, a distance of approximately 700 kilometers. And when he came close to Haran, said Yaakov Avinu, is it possible that I passed a place where my forefathers have prayed, which was Har HaMoriah, and I haven't prayed there? So suddenly he decided to go back. He was near Haran. He decided to go back to Har Moriah. And then, says the Midrash, Kafza lo haaretz, the land contracted beneath him. What is the meaning of this, says Rav Dessler? Time and space are limitations. And to get from Haran back to Har Moriah takes a certain amount of time, and you have to go through all the space. But when there is a spiritual need, a spiritual requirement, just as going back and praying at a certain place, these limitations disappear. And at the precise moment that Yaakov Avinu wanted to go back to Har Moriah, at the next moment he was there already. The limitations of time and space disappeared. How is this possible? I want to expand on this a little bit further. We know that our world was created from a very high spiritual world to a world below it that is less spiritual and more physical, to a world below it that is less spiritual and more physical, and so further down until we come to our physical world that is completely physical and we hardly feel any spiritual essence in this world. And Hashem influences all these worlds and brings down His influence to our physical world through these high spiritual worlds. However, each spiritual world controls and directs the spiritual world below it. Like Rabbeinu Chaim Evolozhin says in Nefesh HaChaim, each world in comparison to the world below it is like neshama and guf, a soul and a body. Just like the soul influences and directs the body, so too a higher spiritual world controls and governs and directs the world below it. And so our physical world is actually governed, actually directed by spiritual worlds above it. And therefore, when there is a spiritual need in one of these high spiritual worlds, this need will direct and control the physical world and change it if there is a spiritual need. This is actually what we call miracles. When we see changes in our physical world that are not according to the laws of nature, we call this a miracle. And it takes place since there is a spiritual need, a spiritual requirement. And just as we have miracles that change space, so too we can have miracles that change the sequence of time and the flow of time. Therefore, the limitations of time and the limitations of space disappear when there is a spiritual need. Rabbi Dessler expands on this further, and he even tells us how did this miracle take place. We shouldn't think, says Rabbi Dessler in Michtav Meliyahu, Volume 1, we shouldn't think that Yaakov Avinu flew very fast from Haran back to Har Moriah. This is not so. Since Yaakov Avinu didn't overcome the limitations of time and space, rather the limitations of time and space disappeared. Like Rabbi Dessler says, Kafza lo haaretz, the land contracted beneath him. These limitations disappeared. And at one moment, we would have seen him near Haran, and at the next moment, he would have disappeared completely and appeared at Har Moriah at the next moment, in contradiction to all the laws of nature, to all the laws of time and all the laws of space. At one moment, he was near Haran, everyone could have seen him, and at the next moment, he would disappear from Haran and appear near Har Moriah. This is truly amazing, truly fascinating. But this is the meaning of Kafza lo haaretz. The limitations of time and space disappear when there is a spiritual requirement. Another example of this idea is brought in the Gemara in Ksuvis. The Gemara says, Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, Kala mikol ha'aratzot, is easier, is quicker than all the other lands, levashel piroteh, in ripening its fruits. And the Maharal says on his commentary to Ksuvas there, Ki dvarim haruchanim, the spiritual things, einam tachat hazman klal, are not under time completely. They are not under the flow of time. V'kol asher hu ruchani yoter, everything that is more spiritual, harei hu memaher lifol, it works much quicker. V'lachen Eretz Yisrael, and therefore the land of Israel, mitzad ktushata, due to its sanctity, memaheret levashel perotea, her fruits ripen even more quickly. Since we're talking about a spiritual requirement, a spiritual need, and therefore the limitations of time and space disappear. So, we have come to a very interesting understanding of time. Time is a result of changes in reality. Our reality changes since it is a physical reality, and such as the physical reality was created, time too was created. And when there is a spiritual need, all of the physical limitations of our world, time and space, can disappear when there is a spiritual need. Since we have come to this point, it would be very interesting to see what modern science has to say about all of what we have found in Jewish sources. What does modern physics have to say about the conclusions that we have reached looking into the Jewish sources? About 100 years ago, Albert Einstein developed the theory of relativity. The theory of relativity was a very big revolution in the world of physics, and it changed the way we understand the world, the way we comprehend, the way we look at the physical world. But since then, the theory of relativity has been verified in thousands of experiments in hundreds of laboratories all over the world. One of the basic ideas of the theory of relativity is that time and space and matter are all part of our reality. The theory of relativity says that without matter and without space, there is no flow of time, since all these are components, are dimensions of our reality. Matter, space, time are all dimensions and all components of our reality. That's a very interesting conclusion that modern physics has come to, since it's consistent with what we have found in Jewish sources 100 years, hundreds of years ago. We have found in the Jewish sources that time is a result of changes in reality, and changes in reality take place since our reality is a physical reality. Theoretical scientists, after Albert Einstein, came to a very interesting conclusion after the theory of the Big Bang. The theory of the Big Bang says that the world was created at a certain point in space and a certain point of time. Scientists came to this conclusion since they show that the galaxies are expanding further away one from the other. And therefore they came to the conclusion that at a certain point in the past, all the galaxies were concentrated at one point, and from that point they were created. So the physical world was created. And since the physical world was created, this is the theory of the Big Bang, theoretical scientists came to the conclusion that time was also created, since time is one of the dimensions of reality. Time is connected to space and connected to matter. And just like the physical world was created, time too was created. One of the most famous theoretical physicists after Einstein was Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking, in his book, A Brief History of Time, says that also in the mathematical calculations of the theory of relativity, which takes into consideration the theory of the Big Bang, we find that time must have a beginning. Even in the mathematical calculations of the theory of relativity, we find that time has a beginning. Time was also created. This conclusion is also fascinating, since we have found it in Jewish sources hundreds of years ago. So modern physics is updating and is being consistent with what we have found in Jewish sources. One of the most fascinating ideas inside the theory of relativity is the relativity of time. We're used to thinking that time is something permanent, something that cannot change. But the theory of relativity says otherwise. The theory of relativity says that time is not something permanent. Time changes. The flow of time changes. Flow of time changes according to speed. That means, if a person travels at a very high speed, the flow of time will be slower. One of the most famous experiments that were done to verify this idea is that the scientists, investigators took a very precise clock and put it on a plane that traveled around the world at a very high speed. When the plane landed, they checked the clock and they saw that a few seconds were missing. Now the meaning of this is not only that the clock was ticking slower, but all the changes in the reality of the plane or people were in the plane were slowed down. Time actually slowed down. I'd like to expand on this idea in order to make it clear, because it's a very basic idea in the theory of relativity. Let's say we were to launch a spaceship at 11 o'clock from a spaceport, and the spaceship traveled at a very high speed and landed an hour later at 12 o'clock back at the spaceport. In the world of the observer, that we would observe the spaceship, we would have seen that 60 minutes passed. But if we would have checked how much time passed inside that spaceship, we would have seen that only 55 minutes passed inside that spaceship. 55 minutes was the time that flowed on all the clocks inside that spaceship. If we were to put a water heater on that spaceship that usually takes 1 hour to boil, the water heater would have come back and not reached a boiling point at all, since in that spaceship only 55 minutes have passed. Time actually flowed slower. Time actually slowed down, since the spaceship was traveling at a very high speed. If you were to take a piece of apple that takes it 1 hour to lose its color, to be discolored, and put it in that spaceship, the apple wouldn't have lost its color. It wouldn't have become discolored, since it takes it 60 minutes. And in that spaceship, only 55 minutes have passed. Time slowed down. If we were to check the bodily functions of the people inside that spaceship, we would have seen that also only 55 minutes transpired through their bodies. This is what the theory of relativity actually says, that when you travel at a very high speed, time actually slows down. So time is not something permanent. This is also a fascinating conclusion that science came to, and it's also consistent with what we have found in Jewish sources. Time is not something permanent. Time can change, since time is one of the dimensions of reality, and all of physical reality can change if there's a spiritual need and a spiritual requirement. So we see something very interesting. Conclusions that science came to only 100 years ago are already found in Jewish sources hundreds of years ago. The truth is that this idea shouldn't surprise us at all, since there's a very basic difference between the approach of scientists and investigators towards the physical world and the approach of our sages towards description of our physical world. Scientists need the scientific investigation, and sometimes they reach conclusions, sometimes it takes them a very long time. But when our sages came to describe the physical world, they didn't describe it through scientific investigation. They described it since they knew the spiritual source of the physical phenomenon. Our sages knew what was going on in the higher spiritual worlds. And since the spiritual world governs and directs the physical world, then all characteristics that we find in the spiritual world, we will also find later in the natural physical world. So when our sages knew the spiritual source of every physical phenomenon, they could have come to the conclusion hundreds of years before the scientists, without need of scientific investigation. This idea is brought by the Maharal in his book Be'er Says the Maharal, Lo ba'u chachamim, our sages didn't come ledaber min hasiba hativit. Our sages didn't come to talk about the natural cause of things. Ki katonu pachut hasiba hativit, since the natural cause of things is of lesser importance. Ki davar ze yeot lechachmei hateva. This is appropriate for the scientists, or larofim, or for the doctors. Lo lachachamim, not for the sages. Aval hem zal, however, our sages, dibru min hasiba shemechayev hateva. Our sages talked about the reason that is above the physical reason, above nature, the cause that is above nature. Shelekol davar, everything, yes siba tivit mechayev, everything has its natural cause. ועל אותה סיבה הטבעית, and above that natural cause, יש סיבה אלוקית, there is a divine cause, והיא סיבת הסיבה. And that cause is the cause above the natural cause. That cause directs, and that cause governs the physical cause here. And since there, if you know the spiritual source, the spiritual root, you will definitely know the rules of the physical thing in our physical world. The Ramchal, in his book Adir Bamarom, also expands on this idea. Says the Ramchal, Hadvarim ha'ele, these things, meaning the inner understanding of things, Ifshar lechachmei hatolada. This is not possible for scientists and for investigators to know. Val dvarim ele, and concerning these things, it says in the Zohar, Shehem lo nimseru lemodadei gvulot. These things were not given out to those who measure the boundaries, meaning the scientists and the investigators. Ki hem inam ela darkei hachitzoniut. These are only the eternal description of things. Umipnimiyut shehi ha'ikar, but concerning the eternal, which is the main characteristics of the things, enam yodim klum, they don't know anything at all. So we see that our sages came to conclusions about the natural world hundreds of years before the scientists, before the investigators, since they knew the spiritual source and spiritual root of everything. And since they knew the spiritual root, they knew all of the characteristics of the physical things. Let us summarize what we have learned until now and all the insights that we have come to at this point. Time is one of the most fascinating phenomena we have in this world. Time is a result of changes. Since our world is a world that changes, we can distinguish between the previous moment, this moment, and the next moment, and we see that there is a flow of time. Time is a result of changes in our physical world. And since our physical world is a world that constantly changes, we can distinguish between the previous moment, this moment, and the next moment. And inside our physical world, there is a constant flow of time. But in a world that does not change, that is not physical, we wouldn't be able to talk about changes in the flow of time. Since our physical world was created, time too was created. And since our physical world can change, the limitations of our physical world can change if there is a spiritual need and spiritual requirement, so too, the pace of time, the flow of time can change, can disappear if there is a spiritual requirement. This is the end of this shiur, the first shiur that talks about time and the nature of time. I appreciate you being with us. The next shiur, I would like to talk about why time was created, why is this world such that it needs a flow of time, and about the interconnection between time and between Shabbos. Thank you very much for being with us, and you're welcome to listen to the next shiur.